Okay, so this is my paper is our paper. I've got two co-authors. What we're interested in is the relationship between art and the economy. We're interested in the relationship between art and the economy, and here is the work preference model, where artists are incentivized. They have a calling, a life's purpose to work, and art is an inexhaustible source of human creativity. But the economy is the reservoir for support. So you need, it's the symbiotic relationship between the inexhaustible human creativity versus the economy as a reservoir for support. And we're interested in that relationship. The paper that I wrote for this conference it's part of research for a book that we're doing. So I'm looking forward to your comments. The paper is mostly about this presentation is mostly about the artistic side as opposed to the economic side. So there's two parts of the paper. Preliminary findings from our musician survey that we did about trying to get inside what's happening in the COVID era, and also as an opportunity to test some propositions in cultural economics. The second half of the paper is about the development of economic science, as opposed from moral philosophy to political economy to economic science to industrial organization, and then how then industrial organization then creates opportunities for rent seeking as special interest groups evolved during the period of expert management or the administrative state. So we start with, and we talked about this in Sydney with, I talked to Trina Dill about this in Sydney about, she's done a lot of work on identifying the artists. And I said, well, you maybe look at Max Weber, who said in the 20th century, he wrote this in 1919 when the state or the welfare state was coming into the fore, the nation state was coming into the fore, is that science and politics then become a vocation. Instead of an avocation, a calling, a love, it now becomes a profession or a vocation. And we're using that art also has become a profession or a vocation in the 20th and 21st century. So industrial classification methods, which we've learned about, have selection bias in that, and I learned that from Richard's co-authors, have selection bias in that it only captures those who are successful in the field, who maybe are working their second job in a field. Say, for example, consider yourself Pablo Picasso Jr., but you're a house painter. You paint houses enough, or signs, billboard signs, just enough to be able to cover your oil paints in the time to be able to paint as you live in the philosopher's hovel somewhere. So we know that artists tend to see themselves as self-employed and entrepreneurs and only work for others to the point needed to subsidize their art as in this example, a house painter. So they get categorized as a house painter, yet their self-reference is as a fine artist, or in this example, an artist, a painter. And what this does is, by using these, I want to call it legacy or mainstream measuring proxies, is that you miss the conventional measuring categories only catch the normal distribution. And Jordy talked about this earlier today about the long-tail distribution. So using conventional methods, you're missing the long-tail distribution in both the supply and demand for, in this case, music. When we're talking about artists, we're talking about music in this case. And so here in the mainstream or legacy or orthodox or industrial organization, say you're using live music as venues with 20,000 people and report to Polestar or something like that. But it misses busking, street performing. Meg Elkins in Melbourne has done a lot of work on busking. Or the performing at the local pubs for free beer on one side, and then the long tail here, you have festivals and concerts in the park, which aren't included in these mainstream measures, which are also part of the competitive environment for live music, depending on how you measure it. Same thing with tastes. You have normal distribution for tastes, and then this misses the long tail tastes, such as working class tastes, such as country music, or highbrow tastes, such as the John Coltrane and other types of jazz. So you're getting immediately industrial organization, regulatory bias, and understanding bias when you start to use these legacy categories, not taking into consideration the long tails of artists who are artists as an avocation instead of a vocation. So, besides the official statistics reported by the U.S. government, and I'm talking about the United States now, people also use lists of arts organizations, say for example the Grammy Association or the American List Council, paid lists, which also have selection bias in selecting those who are already more successful, or those who spend the time filling out forms. So this creates pre-selection problem. So it understates the nature of competition and understates the nature of art as an avocation as opposed to a vocation. It's something you have to do. It's a calling whether or not you make money at it. Samuel Bowles talks about how economists need to look at alternative data sources. So that's what we've done with our work in this in our book. We're looking at we're creating alternative data sources. So you're a musician if you declare yourself a musician. So here's a little bit about the survey that we did. It's a snowball sampling method where we used surveymonkey.com. It was open for a period of time, which I'll discuss. And we didn't use social media. It was done by word of mouth, and we didn't pay anybody. So of course we got close to 0 responses. No, I'm just kidding. We have a few responses. So the survey was open from January to August 2022, and I wanted to keep it open longer. You've seen surveys out there like Students of the World, who there's many ongoing open-ended surveys that look at musical tastes, geographical regions, income, education levels. But ours specifically dealt with the COVID era, the last 2 years of the COVID era. So I didn't want to keep it open because I want the COVID era to be over. I want to be beyond the COVID era, especially being from New York City. So we had 34 questions, 99% completion rate, average time to complete 7.5 minutes, and we had 115 respondents. So our sample is not large enough to make any general claims. We can only give a first look. Pew Research Center, musicians are a particularly difficult class of people from which to gain information. So the first question in our survey, how long have you considered yourself a musician? If the answer is 0, well then you're not a musician. For example, I've known people who didn't take the survey because they didn't consider themselves a musician, and then a few months later then they started to work as musicians, so they could have done the survey. But it's all about self-identification. The average number of years people have been musician in our survey is 28 years. So we kind of probably skew towards the older. So this is Samuel. The first thing we're testing in cultural economics propositions is Samuel Cameron's sad production for music, where he kind of does this tongue-in-cheek because these things are tacit, you can't really measure them. And he doesn't say whether it's quantity or quality of music, but the production function for music is music production is a function of capital, labor, serendipity, authenticity, and drugs. Sad production function. Capital would be capital and labor. Capital would be the technology present at a given time. For example, now the internet, or before that, I guess the CD was designed to be large enough to hold Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or something. And then labor would be the innate talent or the symbiosis amongst the musicians. Serendipity would mean luck. Luck. Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, I hate to keep using this one, said, "Oh, I'm English, so I believe the reason that we're successful is just because we're lucky." And then authenticity means people, his proposition is that people look for something that's real. And that's part of the production function. And then do people use stimulants as part of the creative process? So let's look at the results. These are preliminary results. Just a general first look. Do you think serendipity plays a role in the success of a music artist? And 80% of our respondents believe yes, serendipity does. Do you think authenticity? Again, more than 80% believe that authenticity. And we don't define what success is, nor do we find what the difference is between a musician and a musical artist. All these things remain to be seen and defined by others or not. Do you use stimulants, tea, coffee, marijuana, wine, liquor, etc., as part of the creative process? Significantly or interestingly, more than 75 people say they do. And then entrepreneurship is something difficult. Entrepreneurial talent, entrepreneurial proclivities, entrepreneurial aptitudes, attitudes. So how do you measure that? How do you determine that? So what we asked was, how much do you agree with this statement? Good art can come from bad times. If you know anything about Soviet Union, for example, there's a lot of good art coming out of the Shostakovich and that, but good art can come from bad times. And you'll see that 97% of our respondents agree that good art can come from bad times. And again, we're looking at the first 2 years of the COVID era. We're talking about the COVID era. So the musicians are not all that negative about the COVID era because good art can come from bad times. They experience the shock, but then because they're entrepreneurial oriented, are able to adjust to it in a positive way. And then, interestingly, we also looked at those who find union membership, that union membership is extremely or very important for success, tend to believe that, don't necessarily agree as much, can good art come from bad times? Meaning that those who believe that labor unions are a part of success as a musician tend to be less entrepreneurial oriented. And of course, that's not a surprising finding. And again, we don't have enough respondents to make a general finding. Then insights into the COVID era. How have you been doing creatively and economically during the COVID era? Almost better than before the COVID era or worse than before the COVID era? We will see that musicians are doing worse creatively during the COVID era, except for those that use drugs are doing slightly better creatively during the COVID era. Better or worse economically. You'll see that respondents are doing slightly worse economically, except the labor union members are doing much worse economically. Are you streaming more or less during the COVID era? The entrepreneurial pivot with concert shutdowns, musicians are streaming more, especially those who use drugs are streaming much more, but at the cost of creativity. So our musicians have much more time for creativity during the COVID era, except for those who use drugs have a little less creativity because they're having to stream more. And then labor unions members are the only group that have less time for creativity during the COVID era. On educational longevity in the arts, go back to some of the work that people have done here. If you've been a musician for less than 14 years and greater, or 15 years and greater, so 14 years and less, 15 years and greater, there is no difference. So do you think formal education is important in the success of a musical artist? We don't directly ask, what is your educational level? We just ask, do you think formal education is important in the success of an artist? And you'll see that those musicians who have been musicians longer do not value education any greater than those who have been musicians for less time. So we cannot confirm that those who have value education greater stay in the arts for a longer period of time. On education, it's shown that those with artists with the same level of education as others tend to make less money than those with the same educational levels. So our findings confirm respondents declaring that education is extremely or very important in success make less money than those who don't declare education is important, which confirms that education and income are inversely related in the arts. And uniquely, this is the respondents declaring that education is not important is about the median income in the United States. And then we also have a finding that those who have arts education and work in non-arts fields tend to make more money than those working without education in non-arts fields. And we'll see that that's not true because those declaring that education is important make less of a percentage of their income than those who don't declare education is important. Again, these are just preliminary findings. So that concludes the art part of the research project. Now we'll look at the economy part. Again, the relationship, the economy as a source for support for the arts. We propose that orthodox economic practice is problematic for the future flourishing of arts and cultures. And why is that? This is the debt per person in the United States. Here's the bailouts after the housing boom and bust. Here's the bailouts after the COVID era, excluding the Inflation Reduction Act and excluding any loan forgiveness. Debt per person goes from $40,000 per person to greater than $80,000 per person in the United States in the last 15 years. So, as a classical liberal, looking at the future of flourishing arts, future of flourishing the arts in the United States, arts and culture. We have an unsustainable structural break with all the bailouts that have occurred after the housing boom and bust excuse for intervention, and then the COVID era bust for special interest interventions, deficit funded. Same thing with unfunded liabilities, off-budget liabilities go from less than 200,000 to greater than 300,000. So any person born in the United States today, funded and unfunded liabilities are greater than $400,000, which does not bode well for the future of the flourishing of arts and culture. We found that musicians who value serendipity or luck have done worse than during the COVID era lockdowns than those who don't value serendipity and luck. Because the lockdowns, mandates remove spontaneous order and the ability to get energy from those around you as you create. Thank you.